Good morning, friends. Today we are going to learn Module 1st, Part C, the poem Mending Wall. Robert Frost is the poet who wrote this poem. See, first of all, introduction to the writer. Robert Frost, his period is 1874 to 1963. Was born in San Francisco, California. Frost went to Lawrence High School and later to Dartmouth College in 1892. In 1897, entered Howard University as a special student. He left the university midway and started farming. For some time, he taught in a school also. In 1912, he went to England and settled in Gloucestershire. His first book of poems, A Boy's Will, was published in 1913. He has other publications too, to his credit. He went back to America and settled permanently there. He died in Boston in 1963. Frost's poetry is much appreciated for simplicity, sharp observation, and unaffected lyricism. There is also a meditative quality in his poetry in his poems. Introduction to the poem. The poem Mending Wall is known for its vivid realism that derives home truths which are innate in the heart of man. His style is deceptively simple and hides the complexity of his thought. The setting of the poem is the New England farmers' annual spring ritual of mending the stone walls of farms after hunters and the frost of winter have disordered the walls. Whereas the enlightened speaker in the poem dislikes the division imposed by the wall, the farmer follows the customs and thinks good fences make good neighbors. The poem have symbolic value as well because it presents the traditions and cultures and how the mending wall ceremony is also important for farmers. Poem was published in 1914 as the first entry in Frost's second book of poems, North of Boston. The poem is set in rural England, New England, where Frost lived at the time, and takes its impetus from the rhythms and rituals of life there. The poem describes how the speaker and a neighbor meet to rebuild a stone wall between their properties, a ritual repeated every spring. This ritual raises some important questions over the course of the poem, as the speaker considers the purpose of borders between people and the value of human work. What is the form of the poem? See, Mending Wall does not follow a particular poetic form. It shifts. It isn't a sonnet, for example, or a villanelle. Instead, it is simply a single stanza of 45 lines written in blank verse. The form of Mending Wall is therefore relatively simple. It is also interesting in the way that the form intersects with the poem's content. The long, uninterrupted stanza of the poem visually evokes the subject at hand. The block of text itself is a sort of wall of its own. In fact, if you were to tip the poem on its side and look at it horizontally, with the beginning of each line at the bottom and, and at the ends of lines sticking up into the air. The differing line length look like the wall's uneven, gap-filled top, and the speaker's declaration that the wall isn't necessary comes in the line number 23, the exact center of the poem. See, what is the meter in the poem? Written in blank verse, a form with a prestigious pedigree in England, English literature. It thus may not seem like a particularly promising literary form for a poem about life at the turn of the 20th century in New England. But for poets like Shakespeare, Milton, and Frost, the appeal of blank verse lies in the proximity to spoken English. It is the meter that the most closely approximates the language's natural rhythm and intonation. In the hands of skilled poet, blank verse thus fades into the background. A reader may not even realize that a poem or a monologue is in meter. Frost works in this tradition, though Mending Wall is a metrical poem, as meter is often imperceptible and is certainly unobtrusive. It can most broadly be thought of as iambic pentameter, with most, though certainly not all, lines have 10 syllables. Line number 9 is an example of perfect iambic pentameter to please the yelping, yelping dogs, the gaps, I mean. But Frost tolerates an unusually high number of metrical substitutions, some of them quite startling if a reader is paying attention to the meter. However, few readers will be paying close attention. Frost uses these substitutions to keep the poem from feeling stilled and literary. Instead, the poem's many metrical substitutions help it capture the liveliness and variability of actual speech. For instance, the poem's first line begins with a trochee before settling into an iambic rhythm. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. In starting the poem with a trochee and then sliding gradually into iambs, the poem disguises its underlying rhythm. At the moment when the reader's ear is trying to find that rhythm. Though the poem is broadly in pentameter, many lines also do not have 10 syllables. This creates lines of varying visual lengths. The entire poem is one long block of text, which looks kind of like a wall if you were to turn the poem on its side. These differing line lengths resembles the wall's gap-filled top full of holes where stones syllables have toppled off. See the rhyme scheme of the poem. Mending walls is in blank verse, though the poem does not have a regular rhyme scheme. It does contain occasional stand and perfect rhymes, which often serve to emphasize moments of particular literary intensity. The speaker of the poem is clearly educated and fluent in literary tradition. When it suits the speaker's aim, the speaker is willing to forge the poem's unpretentious plainness in favor of a more elegant style. This happens For instance, in line 41 and 42, when the speaker rhymes me and trees in couplet, he moves in darkness as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. See, here we can understand how the rhyme scheme is used by Robert Frost. Rhyming couplets of iambic pentameter are also called heroic couplets, a form typically reserved for and associated with poems about heroic subjects, usually written by elite educated poets. Frost switches briefly into the form precisely when his poem takes on an elevated, grand tone, containing the speaker's neighbor to a powerful and persistent force in human life. However, most of the poem's rhymes are slant rhymes like a line and again in line 13 and 14. These slant rhymes tend to emphasize the way that the poem falls short of an expected and traditional literary grandeur. Thank you. Here we can understand the structure of the poem. First of all, what is the introduction to the author? After that, what is the gist of the poem, Mending the Wall? How the farmers in New England celebrated the ceremony of mending wall, and how the wall is disordered because of the frosts of winter and the hunters. So here we can understand how the poet want to suggest and tell to the reader about the mending wall and how the farmers affected due to the mending wall. And here we also see the rhyme scheme and how it is a blank verse poem. So in the next part we will see what is the theme of the poem and why it is titled as a mending wall and what is the significance of the mending wall in the life of the farmer. Till then, thank you.